It was a cold, foggy morning in the sleepy town of Pinebrook when Clara found the eggs. She was a farmhand, hired to tend to the henhouse on Dr. Winslow's estate, a sprawling, isolated property at the edge of the town. The hens were usually consistent layers, but recently something had been off. Egg production has dwindled, and Clara often found the hens squawking without any particular reason. Today, however, she stumbled upon a peculiar sight. Tucked away in the farthest, darkest corner of the henhouse was a small cluster of unfamiliar eggs. Unlike the typical brown, speckled eggs laid by the hens, they were oddly textured grayish-black with a strange leathery surface that almost seemed to pulsate when she touched them. Clara's curiosity got the better of her. She carefully gathered the eggs in her arms, shivering as their surface seemed to twitch against her fingers. They were quite heavier than expected, with a faint, sickly warmth emanating from within. "Maybe Dr. Winslow will know what these are," she muttered to herself, stepping out into the thick morning fog. Dr. Winslow was a reclusive scientist who had moved to Pinebrook a decade ago. The townsfolk whispered that he had been a biologist at some prestigious institute before an undisclosed scandal forced him into seclusion. Since then, he had kept to himself, conducting bizarre experiments in his basement lab. When Clara presented the strange eggs to him, Winslow's eye widened with a mix of fascination and something darker. He took the eggs from her without a word, carrying them down into his laboratory. "I'll need to study this further. You may go," he said, his voice hollow and distracted. Clara hesitated but eventually turned to leave. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake by bringing the eggs to him. She could hear Winslow's voice muttering to himself as she ascended the stairs. His words were too faint to make out, but the tone was one of manic excitement. Later that night, as Clara lay in her small room on the second floor, she heard a faint screeching sound. She dismissed it as rats in the walls, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, like something trying to crawl its way out. The next morning, Clara woke to find the farmhouse eerily silent. Normally she would hear the clucking of hens and the creaking of the old house settling, but today there was nothing, just a dense, suffocating silence. Stilling herself, she made her way down to the basement. The door was ajar, a faint, acrid smell wafting up from below. As she descended, the air grew thicker, almost syrupy, and her eye began to water. The sight that greeted her in the lab was enough to freeze the blood in her veins. The egg had hatched. What emerged from them wasn't like any creature Clara had ever seen. They were fleshy, wriggling things with thick wet skin that seemed to pulsate and undulate. Dozens of thin, tender-like appendages extended from the bodies, twitching in search of something to grasp. But the worst part was their eyes, multiple dark, lidless orbs that fixed on Clara as she entered the room. Dr. Winslow was nowhere to be found, but his notes were scattered across the table. Clara picked up a page, her hands shaking as she read the words scrawled in frantic handwriting. "The eggs are not avian in origin. The creatures within are growing rapidly, feeding on something. They seem to adapt to their surroundings, becoming more aware. I fear they are not just creatures. They are a part of something larger. Clara's instincts screamed for her to run, but curiosity and terror kept her rooted to the spot. The creatures, which had been confined to the lab table, began to slither toward her, their appendages leaving a slick trail of mucus. Suddenly, one of the creatures launched itself at her leg, its tendrils wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, kicking frantically, but the thing was surprisingly strong. As it climbed up her body, she felt an intense burning sensation when it touched her skin, as if it were injecting something into her flesh. The pain was unbearable, and she collapsed to the floor, writhing as a sickening warmth spread throughout her body. It was as if her blood has turned to fire, coursing through her body and transforming her from the inside out. She could feel her bones shifting, her muscles stirring and reforming, as if something was growing within her, around her, instead of her. The creatures slithered away as Clara's screams echoed through the basement. She tried to crawl towards the stairs, but her limbs were no longer under her control. Her fingers twisted and elongated, bones cracking as they turned into grotesque, chitinous claws. She could feel something moving beneath her skin, pushing its way out. Her body was no longer her own. It has become a grotesque chrysalis, giving birth to something alien and monstrous. Her skin split open like an overripe fruit, revealing a thick, undulating mass of flesh and tendrils. Through the haze of pain and terror, Clara caught her reflection in an old, dusty window on the wall. What looked back at her was a nightmare, a grotesque fusion of human and creature, her face barely recognizable beneath a layer of twisted flesh and pulsing veins. But she was still alive, her mind trapped in this monstrous shell. The creatures had not killed her, they had transformed her, repurposed her into something that was both part of them and yet separate. She could hear their whispers now, an alien chorus that spoke of hunger, expansion, and the need to consume. Dr. Winslow appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of horrified fascination. "Amazing, simply incredible," he exclaimed. "I never expected the mutation to take hold so quickly. Clara, you've become perfect." But Clara was no longer Clara. She was something far beyond the woman who had gathered those cursed eggs. She could feel the creature's hive mind pressing into her consciousness, urging her to spread the infection. The hunger was insatiable. With a strength that was no longer her own, she lunged at Dr. Winslow. Tendrils erupted from her back, wrapping around his neck, pulling him into her grotesque embrace. He screamed, but it was quickly cut off as her newly formed jaws unhinged, consuming him in multiple savage bites. Clara, or better, an amalgamation of human and creature, emerged from the farmhouse, her new form dripping with viscera. The tiny creatures reappeared, slithering behind her, ready to spread their influence between the confines of the Winslow estate. The people of Pinebrook were unaware of the nightmare crawling towards them. By the time they realized the threat, it would be too late. The town would become a nest, a breeding ground for the horrific fusion of flesh and alien biology that had taken root within Clara. As she marched towards the town, Clara could hear the creature's whispers in her mind, urging her onward. more. The nest would grow, and it would never stop.